You know, we live in a pretty weird time for movies, especially the blockbuster. If we're being honest with ourselves here, it feels like blockbusters are the only things that actually get theatrical releases anymore. That's not actually true, of course, but it's a feeling that's hard to shake nonetheless. For the most part, the mid-budget film has kind of fallen by the wayside, pretty much going straight to streaming more times than not. Dramas, comedies, thrillers, and even more traditional action movies, for the most part, just don't get produced at the rate they did 15 or even 10 years ago. Now, you'll still get an Oppenheimer or a Sinners once or twice a year, but for every one of those, you'll get about a dozen massive $300 million franchise films that, at least as of 5 or so years ago, were pretty much guaranteed successes at the box office. I mean, just take last year for example. We got Jurassic World Rebirth, 2 live-action Disney remakes, the Minecraft movie, 3 new installments in the MCU, and Superman. Not to say those movies are necessarily terrible, but we certainly are in an era overall where blockbuster movies are bigger, dumber, and, let's just say it, worse than they ever were before. All that to say, man, the Indiana Jones trilogy is just so good. Those 3 movies, to me at least, are just the absolute peak of the action-adventure genre. They're just these 3 almost impossibly perfect examples of pop filmmaking. They are everything that Lucas, Spielberg, Ford, and Williams did best, boiled down, perfected, and committed to film. Raiders and The Last Crusade especially are just 2 of the most unimpeachably perfect movies ever made. Which leaves 1984's Temple of Doom to be in kind of a weird place. It's either an odd outlier, an underrated gem, or the straight-up black sheep of the trilogy, depending on who you ask. Especially at the time of its release, it was widely hated by a good amount of critics, with People magazine infamously describing it as a quote-unquote cinematic form of child abuse. Which is, kinda silly and all, but also, can you really blame them? This movie is absurdly, ridiculously dark. And also just truly insane. It's up there with Halloween 3 or Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 in the bizarre, tangential sequel department. But that's also not a bad thing at all. In fact, that's definitely a big part of the reason why this movie has such an enduring fan base to this day. Its unabashed strangeness, combined with the fact that there are now 2 undeniably worse Indiana Jones sequels, has resulted in it kind of shedding its black sheep status. I know as a kid, it never even crossed my mind that Temple was somehow lesser than Raiders or Last Crusade. But about a year ago, I rewatched all 3 of these movies for the first time in well over a decade, and I've seen them a couple times since then. And to be honest, I kinda started to see where the critics were coming from on this one, just a little bit. So let's take a trip back to 1984 to find out if the most controversial Indiana Jones adventure has stood the test of time. But before we dive into the human sacrifice and the child slavery and all that fun stuff, I have to take a minute and ask that if you enjoy this video at all, I would really appreciate a like, a comment, or maybe even a new subscriber. These videos do take a little bit of work to make, and every little bit goes a long way. So I think the best way to start things off is to simply address the major points of criticism that have been lobbed at this movie over the years. First things first, the elephant in the room. Since the time of its release, Temple of Doom has always had a reputation for being, a little bit racist. And at the risk of coming across as a complete and utter fence-sitter, I just have to be honest. As a white dude from the States, I really don't feel particularly qualified to comment on these elements. That said, it would be ridiculously disingenuous of me to just ignore them, because let's be real, that is and always has been a pretty major talking point surrounding this particular movie. As to whether or not Temple of Doom is in fact racist and or culturally insensitive, I just don't think it's as simple as a straight up yes or no answer. Fact is, I'm sure that Lucas, Spielberg, and co-writers William Hayek and Gloria Katz didn't go into this project with malicious and hateful intent, but also dude, come on, you have to be doing some serious mental gymnastics to not see that there are some pretty questionable elements in this movie. The infamous dinner scene, for instance, is not the best look in the world, But I think a lot of that comes down to some missing context. The script has a few lines from Indy where he says, quote unquote, "Even if they were trying to scare us away, a devout Hindi would never touch meat. Makes you wonder what these people really are." So, as scripted, the dinner scene is clearly supposed to be less of a mockery of Indian culture and more of an early tip-off that something isn't quite right at Pankot Palace. But those lines never made it into the final cut, and without that added context, yeah, it's really not hard to see why people take issue with this scene. And honestly, I think the dinner scene is a pretty perfect microcosm of this movie as a whole. I really truly don't think it was supposed to come across as offensive, and some added context would have pretty likely helped it out there. But straight up, I think when you're riffing off of 1930s adventure serials in your movie about a death cult made up entirely of Indian men, it's almost impossible not to come across as inadvertently, just a little bit, racist. But hey, I'm kinda tired of talking about this. There's a whole lot more to Temple of Doom than just this one element, so I'll sum it up like this. I think it's ultimately a pretty complicated and subjective issue. I just don't think there's a simple, comfortable, one-size-fits-all answer with this one. Those elements are definitely there, but the extent to which they affect your enjoyment of this film, well, your mileage may vary. Another often maligned aspect of Temple of Doom is the new love interest in this film, Willie Scott. Now, ever since 1984, people have generally had quite negative opinions on this character. And yeah, it's really not hard to see why on this one either. And that's because at her best, she's, a fun character, but at her worst, she's just insufferable. Now, I understand what they were going for here. Taking this spoiled, whiny lounge singer character and having her tag along with Indiana Jones on what is, let's be real, his most disgusting and depraved adventure is definitely a fun concept on paper, but I just don't think they quite managed to pull it off in execution. Now, Kate Capshaw definitely understood the assignment, and she does bring a degree of much-needed likability to this character that, simply put, wouldn't have been there had someone else played the role. She's not the worst character in the world, but she is easily the worst of the sidekicks/love interests in these movies. Lastly, my personal biggest issue with Temple of Doom definitely lies in the pacing. Temple of Doom has built up something of a reputation for being essentially a roller coaster put on film, which is understandable because, it literally is for a second there. But the problem is, it's either the most insane, action-packed movie that anybody has ever seen, or it's just straight up boring. It starts great and it ends even better. But from the time they arrive at the village until, weirdly enough, the dinner scene, it's just a brutally slow watch. Raiders and Last Crusade certainly never moved as fast as Temple, but they also never felt nearly as sluggish in places either. Last Crusade was definitely a lot more of a slow burn, but Sean Connery and the overall dynamic between Indy and his father always keeps you feeling invested. And Raiders is just about the most perfectly paced movie ever. But Temple is simply a much more uneven experience from start to finish. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the increased level of violence and overall oppressively dark tone of this movie stirred up quite a bit of controversy back in the day. And even now, I still see people taking issue with this for whatever reason. But this is where I have to draw a line in the sand. Temple of Doom may have plenty of issues, for sure, but it being a nightmarish fever dream simply isn't one of them. The main villain's signature move is literally ripping people's beating hearts out of their chests. What else is there to even say? I feel like this complaint comes almost exclusively from parents. You have to remember that back in the 80s, parents groups were on the prowl to find just about any kind of violent, provocative, generally cool media, and pretty much ruin it. 1984 also saw the release of Silent Night, Deadly Night, which proved to be so controversial that it was pulled from theaters just 2 weeks after its release. And on some level at least, I can see where they're coming from. Raiders was a crowd-pleasing summer blockbuster after all. Some exploding Nazi heads notwithstanding, it was overall relatively tame. These were the guys who made Star Wars and E.T. after all. So I can see why parents at the time were less than pleased. But I feel like everybody who saw this movie as a kid loved it, explicitly because of how dark and wild it all is. It's like watching an R-rated movie at a sleepover, except with this one, your parents will probably just let you watch it. It gives this film such a unique identity and texture. It's just as much trash cinema subversiveness as it is a fun summer adventure. There really is just nothing else like it. But it also has a whole lot more going for it than just fiery human hearts and death cults. It also has the best action in the trilogy. The chaotic Shanghai brawl, the literal roller coaster ride that is the minecart chase, and of course, the rope bridge. Machete-wielding Indiana Jones on a rickety bridge precariously dangling over a river filled with hungry alligators is just so stupid that it's genius. If you ask me, it's the best moment in the whole series. The hand-to-hand fights are also particularly brutal this time around. These films always really excelled at making the action, no matter how ridiculous it actually is, feel gritty and grounded. Punches have weight, characters are sweaty and disheveled, and Indy himself, he's not some expert hand-to-hand combatant. He pretty much only ever wins through sheer grit and luck. This scrappy, dirty quality is probably at its most noticeable in Temple, especially in the mine fight scene with that slave driver guy, who, by the way, is just that giant Nazi with the mustache from Raiders with painted skin. Just throwing that out there. It always feels like Indiana Jones is on the back foot in Temple of Doom. He gets poisoned at the start, loses his pistol, gets possessed by black magic, and almost gets his heart ripped out. It adds the feeling that there are real stakes. No matter how many times you've seen it, it still feels like the characters may not make it out of the titular Temple of Doom, which is a feeling that very few other movies like this really have. But you know what? Speaking of characters, this movie has some pretty good ones. Mola Ram is peak over-the-top bad guy. There's legit nothing to him other than being the most evil dude ever, and I love it. I mean, he doesn't even show up until like halfway through the movie, and it just doesn't even matter. He's simultaneously the least developed, yet for my money, best villain in the trilogy. He's almost even more than Indiana Jones himself, the mascot of this movie. He's got a great evil laugh, a silly ass little escape hatch, and that awesome skull hat thing. And again, he does this. I don't really need to say more. Also, this movie is the one and only appearance of Short Round. With the exception of Sean Connery, I would say that Short Round is easily the best sidekick in any of these movies. He's probably the most universally well-liked aspect of this film. On paper, he should be super annoying, but he just never is. Which probably comes down to the fact that despite being like 10 years old, he's both competent and useful. Ke Huy Quan just feels very natural in the role, and his chemistry with Harrison Ford is also genuinely fantastic. Short Round really helps to humanize Indy. Their bond is one of the few wholesome, classic Spielberg things in this twisted movie. And speaking of Indiana Jones himself, I have spent a ton of time talking about anything and everything except the guy the movie's named after, so let's remedy that. I don't think this film gets the recognition it deserves for just how peak this version of Indiana Jones really is. In Raiders, he's a pretty standard one-note action hero. He likes finding ancient artifacts, and kissing Marion, and punching Nazis, and that's about it. The only real lesson he learns in the whole movie is finally understanding and respecting the power of the Ark. It's a character that, if we're being honest with ourselves, is really mostly carried by the powerhouse charisma of early 80s Harrison Ford. Now, in Last Crusade, he obviously has a lot more going on. His complicated relationship with his father is a massive reason why Last Crusade is unimpeachably the best Indiana Jones movie ever. It's just a fact. His arc in that movie is so great that unfortunately people tend to forget about his journey in Temple of Doom. You see, the second film actually takes place a year before Raiders. When we first meet Indy in Temple, he's much more of a scoundrel than we usually know him to be. He's very Han Solo-ish, for lack of a better term. He really isn't interested in preserving ancient history so much as he is profiting from it. He's less it belongs in a museum, and a lot more fortune and glory. A line he frequently drops throughout this sequel. It isn't until the village shaman sends him to find the Shankara stones, and he sees the general evil going on at Pankot Palace, that he becomes the far more principled, heroic version of him that we see in the other films. And while it's obviously a whole lot of fun to watch him kill some Nazis, I would argue there's no more satisfying moment in the franchise than seeing him rescue the child slaves and brutalize the slave drivers. His character arc is great in Temple, and while I'm certainly not the first to talk about it, I still feel like it deserves a lot more credit than it gets. Harrison Ford also got pretty jacked for this movie in an era when that just wasn't common. I mean, just take a look at Michael Keaton in Batman 89. That, combined with the tattered shirt and the machete, really adds up for easily the coolest version of Indiana Jones ever. I mean, I almost feel bad for these evil cult dudes having to fight this fedora-wearing maniac. So, does Temple of Doom stand the test of time? Well, right now, I'd say yes. But there are times when I might be a little more apprehensive in my answer. There are plenty of times when I love this movie, but also a lot of times when I really see what the critics are talking about. Because Temple is just a classic example of a mixed bag. When it's good, it's amazing, but it isn't always good. There are legit problems with it. And because of that, as well as the inherently extreme and polarizing nature of online discourse, this film has become a bit of a poster child for the phrase, you either love it or you hate it, which has led me to having a potentially pretty unorthodox take on this one. That thumbnail wasn't just clickbait. I really do think that Temple of Doom is both overrated and underrated. Well, kind of. Depending on who you talk to and what video you click on, Temple is either the most action-packed, nail-biting, awesome adventure film ever made, or it's a juvenile, overly mean-spirited, gross-out fest that's also racist. And while I understand both of these takes, I just can't co-sign with either one. It definitely does have some very noticeable flaws, some of which I didn't even touch on for the sake of brevity, such as the, at times, lackluster effects from Industrial Light and Magic. But if you can look past all the issues and take it for what it is, it's awesome. Incredible action, some truly unhinged horror elements, some actually really funny humor, an incredible John Williams score, a delightfully evil villain, and of course, the best version of Indiana Jones ever. So all in all, 42 years later, I'd say it's still more than worth taking another trip back into the heart of the Temple of Doom. But I'll probably have a totally different opinion in like a week or two, so you know.